please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Well, the government recently came out with its draft e-commerce policy, which seeks to give Indian online retailers a level playing field when they're pitted against the global big boys. This is also an attempt to try and in the government's assessment, prevent the bloodletting in the brick-and-mortar businesses. The draft policy, among others, recommends a sunset clause which defines the maximum duration for which e-tailers can engage in differential pricing strategies. This might make it difficult for big online retailers to shower deep discounts on customers for a prolonged period of time. That's not all. The draft policy further places curbs on related parties, recommends that bulk purchases of white goods, which could lead to price distortions in a marketplace, be prohibited. Further, no foreign-funded company be allowed to keep inventory. Will this India-first approach really create a level playing field for domestic players? According to a report by eMarketer, e-commerce sales will climb about 31% to $32.7 billion in 2018. That's not all. The e-commerce market in India is expected to grow to $200 billion by 2026. That's the kind of opportunity that we're talking about. To discuss the draft e-commerce policy and its implications for India, we're now joined by the former DIPP Secretary Ajay Dua, Amarjeet Singh, Partner Tax, Regulatory and Internet Business at KPMG, and Abhiraj Behel, co-founder at Urban Clap. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Mr. Dua, let me start by asking you, I mean, what is it in this draft e-commerce policy that is going to change the rules of the game, so to speak? Do we not currently have regulation in place that is enough to regulate this ecosystem?
Shireen, you're probably right that bits and pieces about what's in this draft policy have been stated by different wings of the government and at different points of time. This will probably, the attempt or the endeavor seems to be to put them down in one comprehensive policy at one place, even the existing rules and regulations be compiled and put out. But having said that, the question is, what the government seems to have defined the objective for it, which you very rightly called it as India First. That India First for the sake of, are we looking at it as the retailers or the producers or the larger universe of consumers? Does it take adequate, or is there adequate balance in this policy, the draft policy, for all three, particularly the Indian consumer?
You believe that the Indian consumer is actually going to be at the receiving end if these recommendations go through?
Looks like.
Okay.
There is a very high degree of possibility.
Okay, that this is actually going to be anti-consumer. But let me go across to Amarjeet. Amarjeet, you know, just to take the point forward from what Mr. Dua was saying, I mean, if you take a look at what this draft e-commerce policy suggests, areas that are highlighted include regulation, funding, pricing, discounting, data storage, consumer grievance and protection. Now, under the press notes earlier issued by government, we have a lot of these regulations in place. You already have the Competition Commission of India that looks at anti-competitive practices. We're now talking about the need for a new regulator that will regulate only e-commerce. Is this a little over the top?
I think, Shin, you're absolutely right. Because I think what they are trying to do is trying to actually control a sector which is booming today, which is attracting foreign investment. And if you try to actually put a policy around a sector which is which is dependent upon innovation, dynamism, I think we are just trying to choke this entire sector by putting multiple regulation and actually creating a regulator around something which has so many verticals. There are so many different kind of entrepreneurs which have started e-commerce. Now the point is, again, there's a confusion between what are they trying to control. E-commerce as a term encompasses so many verticals, whether it is in relation to financial services, whether it is in relation to e-tailing, whether it is in relation to travel, etc. You know, getting a single policy around everything, I think, is going to create a problem. And in any case, I think we've got some robust press notes already, like press note 3 on its own talks about influencing price from a discount perspective. Press Note 3 on its own talks about 25% limitation in terms of not one vendor can sell. Press Note 3 covers so many aspects relating to e-tailing today. I think there's definitely an overreach of the legislature which we are seeing here, because today what they are saying, not only the platform can not only influence, but they are now trying to control the vendor, technically speaking. Now, how can you control a vendor whether he can give discounts or not? So I think somewhere you're absolutely right. We are just going too much into details, and this will actually create a problem for the sector's growth.
It will create a problem. This is a case of overreach. That is the view there of Amarjeet. But Abhiraj, as an entrepreneur, as somebody who runs Urban Club, what do you make of the many changes that the government is talking about through its recommendations in this draft e-commerce policy? And as Amarjeet was pointing out, a lot of this in some form or fashion already exists as part of the regulatory architecture. How do you read this?
Well, I think in our case, I was part of the think tank which was advising the government on the national policy for e-commerce. I think the government is, honestly looking at it at three levels. The first is, how do you create a level playing field between global companies and Indian companies? How do you ensure that things like capital dumping, etc. don't happen?
What is an Indian company today, Abhiraj? What is an Indian company today? Most Indian companies, most Indian e-tailers are funded by the Japanese, are funded by the Chinese, are funded by the American. What is an Indian company today in a market where capital is global in nature?
Absolutely, I agree with you, and I think that's a question that needs to be discussed and debated. I'm just sort of narrating to you what is the view of the government as they are forming this policy without taking a judgment on it. So one of their views is that can Indian homegrown organizations, not taking into account a few big names who've been well funded, the broader spectrum of Indian startups, can we create a level playing field for them compared to the global behemoths? That's one. I think the second is also, can we make sure that SMEs, small and medium enterprises, can leverage the power of e-commerce, can actually grow and are not impacted, and their rights can be protected. And I would say a big part, at least the meetings that I've been a part of, a large focus is on the consumer. This is not just with respect to discounting. This is with respect to things like data protection. The data that is emerging from India, is that data going to be protected? What about privacy? And this is not limited to India. GDPR has recently come out in the EU. The United States has made, significant progress. Now, I think we've, in no uncertain terms, made our point very, very clear that any regulation should be as light touch as possible. Because if there is over-regulation, and if
doesn't look like light touch regulation, Abhiraj, even though you were part of the consultation process, let me ask you, does this look like light touch regulation to you? An honest answer.
At this point of time, it definitely does not look like light touch. I think this is, for a first draft, very, very, this is very significant regulation, and that, it's something that does concern me, to be honest, because I think we've seen, sectors like IT and ITES, which for a very long time did not, have any regulation. Actually, today, one of the best governed sectors, highest levels of corporate governance. Yes. They've given us the first $100 billion company. In TCS and other sectors which have apparently a lot of regulation, whether it's banking or electricity or telcos, one can't argue exactly in that favor. So I think we're in the early stages of the e-commerce sector. I wouldn't say there should be no regulation, but always been in favor of minimal regulation.
There is regulation. I don't understand where the question of no regulation comes in. There is regulation. There are very clear press note directives that are in place. So I don't understand where the question of no regulation comes in. But let me go back across to Ajay Dua. Mr. Dua, you know, I can understand some of the anxiety that homegrown startups are faced with. And I would also imagine that there is some legitimacy to the argument that, you know, the Companies Act be amended to allow Indian promoters to have more control despite even small shareholding. I would imagine that perhaps ought to have been something that should have been done in the past. Maybe now it's a little too late, but this is perhaps a consideration that should be taken forward. But, you know, as Abhiraj himself is pointing out, and he was part of this consultative process, maybe the well-intentioned, but now over the top. What would you be most worried about from the you know, plethora of recommendations that this e-commerce policy puts forward?
As I once said, we got to look at the consumer, as put him at the center of things, and then form the policy. As of now, I think it's an early thoughts on the subject within the government, and that too by putting together what already existed in various other dispensations, rules, regulations, press notes, etc. of the government. I would like to see, going forward, first, e-commerce being more precisely defined. Where would this policy be applicable? And not, as was mentioned earlier, that does it cover e-financing, does it cover e-travel, all those kind of, number one. Number two, I would like to see in this policy no creation of another regulatory body. Regulations, as you said, is different from centralizing the administration into one particular body. The regulator can't be looking at the competition aspects. That will have to be looked at by the Competition Commission, unless by law you amend the law and take away their powers. Similarly, when we talk about FDI, here the draft policy says complaints about FDI will also be looked at by the regulator. What happens to the Reserve Bank of India? What happens to the Ministry of Finance and others? So I think let's not centralize everything just to keep a body occupied. That's the number two. Number three, I would like to see in this much greater ability to implement what is being thought of, particularly in the context of 49% FDI in what we are calling inventory-based model, and only if all the goods are locally sourced, which I think there are three distinct conditions being put there. Are we moving towards that in our whole scheme of retailing, or are we liberalizing there but bringing about greater limitations and constraints when it comes to e-commerce? Finally, I would like to see in this that recognize, as you very rightly in the beginning said, that capital is global. So I would say now production is also global. Competitive advantages of production, advantages or the benefits of it must flow to the consumer around the world. And if a particular item can be sourced from outside the country because there happens to be a comparative advantage in that, why should we say that the foreign capital cannot deal with it? When the foreign capital brings with it maybe cheaper capital, brings with it economies of scale, and also will be able to demonstrate all the advantages with modern telecommunication, computer-based, digital-based economies have.
Amarjit, let me ask you, as I pointed out, of the many recommendations made on the issue of ownership, perhaps that is a point worth considering and worth pondering over. The need to amend the relevant provisions in the Companies Act so as to facilitate founders to have control over their e-commerce companies despite having a small shareholding. This obviously in light of the experiences that we've already seen play out. Do you believe that that is a legitimate concern that requires some degree of intervention at this point?
So, Shireen, if we just look at the Indian Companies Act, it talks about differential voting rights already. And there are rules under which they say that the company should actually be profitable for a period of 3 years. The DVRs cannot be in excess of 26%. So there are already regulations about differential voting rights which are existing under the Companies Act. but this is an instrument which talks about differential voting rights. As far as the control is concerned, which is the point which has been referred to in this particular policy,
yes,
that is something which is typically going along with a contractual relationship. Now, when they are talking about that the control should remain with the Indian founder, it means we are talking about a third kind of instrument which has to come into play, which is besides a DVR or a version of a DVR itself. So that would require a change as far as the Companies Act is concerned, and I think which can be done. But the point is, just think about a fact. If we just look at what we have seen in case of some of the unicorns in India, yes, the founders have been diluted as far as the equity is concerned, but they still control a lot of operations. So there are, in their agreements, they already have a lot of operational control in terms of as far as the entity is concerned, even when they are holding 8 to 10% of the equity. So that is already existing. I think by putting all these things, we are actually confusing the foreign investor now. Because what is going to happen if an Indian founder goes and tells a foreign investor, you put in the money, but I will retain the control based on the fact because the government has told me so, it will become difficult even for the founder to raise money. So I would say that the current regime on its own is good enough. And, you know, and the definition of control, and the definition of control under the FDI policy of FEMA 20 is they already talk about control over board of directors, control over management and operations, and those already exist with the Indian founders. I'm just saying there's a confusion which is being created by putting all these things.
Exactly. That was my point, that there is enough regulation already in place. So I don't understand where the issue of there is no regulation and hence we require some regulation, where that comes in from. But Abhiraj, let me ask you, because you have acknowledged the fact that you believe that this has become over the top. What you wanted was light touch and this is OTT. What is it that you have a problem with on the basis of what you've seen in this 19-page document?
I think, you know, I will not get into the specifics of the document, but, you know, my larger concern, you know, as an entrepreneur is with regulation per se. The fact that there will be a regulator and now there will be regulatory oversight that will be deciding the pace at which this industry should move. I'll take a small example. You know, one of the recommendations talks about the need to have data centers in India. This is actually going to impact startup companies because most of us will use AWS and you know, cloud-based solutions, whether it's for data, whether it's for cloud computing, and if you need to have, you know, data housed in India, it actually increases your cost. So it makes you less you know, less competitive. It makes the cost of starting up a little bit higher, and more importantly, you have to interface with some government department, some government regulator, which is never easy and something that an entrepreneur does not want to do. So I think my larger concern is this interface that will get created at various points of your business, which, as we know, you know, the interesting part here is the intent is always good. I think, you know, the government is coming from a place of great intent. They want to help Indian entrepreneurs, Indian companies, Indian consumers. But we understand the intention in the long run doesn't work, because over a period of time you will have you will have regular government officials who will man these positions, and will fundamentally regulatory cholesterol will set in, which will stop the pace of innovation. So that's my larger concern.
Regulatory cholesterol. That's a nice term. But you know, I do want to point out that we really have to be careful what we wish for, and this is the message to India's startup ecosystem, because you know, people were lobbying with the government, seeking government intervention, and now look where you find yourselves. So you know, you really have to be careful what you wish for. But regulatory cholesterol should not block the arteries of India's e-commerce ecosystem. That's a good one to take a break on. We'll be back with a lot more. Stay with us. Well, we're discussing the national e-commerce draft policy. Is it a case of legislative overreach if it does go through? We're joined by Amarjeet Chopra of KPMG, Abhiraj Behel of Urban Clap, Ajay Dua, the former DIPP secretary. We're also going to be joined by Mukesh Aghi, to give us a perspective on how US companies are looking at these developments. But let me get wrap-up comments from each of you, and let me start by asking you, Mr. Dua, we've seen this, it's a draft, so there is time for more consultation to take place. Do you believe that the government should give this up altogether, or would you suggest some changes?
A fair amount of changes, but I would start with the process. There is need for much greater consultation outside the government, the stakeholders. And that's number one. Second, the government must keep in mind that a retail policy has to be, and we are talking about B2C, retail policy has to keep the consumer at the heart, center of things, and not a few other e-commerce operators and saying level playing field for them. We want actually a better deal for the Indian consumer. And finally, I would say we need to keep in mind that there are some overall government's objectives. One of that is to attract more foreign investment into the country.
Right.
Second, while we want to protect our brick-and-mortar stores, the policy with respect to those multi-brand retail also has been evolving over time.
Yes.
So let's not get obsessed by saying that status quo, the policy of brick-and-mortar stores having to be kind of given protection.
Right.
That should not override be the overriding consideration when we talk about our e-commerce policy for the future.
Okay. Amarjeet, how worried would you be? It's a $30 billion business in India today, has huge potential. If these changes that the government is proposing were to go through, do you believe that this will slow things down considerably?
It might not slow down because the dynamism of Indian startup ecosystem has just started. I don't think it's going to slow it down. But the ability of funding is something which is going to create problem. Today, if I just look at Amazon, it is at $800 billion market cap. Alibaba at almost $500 billion market cap. Don't we want our don't we want our startups to reach that particular level? If we are going to put constraints around their growth, then what is the purpose of putting such a fantastic startup policy? I've been personally involved in the drafting of the startup policy with the government, giving them so many tax incentives, FDI incentives around funding, etc. If you are giving so much benefits to the startup ecosystem, by creating an e-commerce policy, I think you are actually negating the entire progress which we are making on the startup ecosystem.
Okay.
We talk about all these excellent programs which the government has started. We need to just keep pushing this agenda further and further. We need more money because the Indian investor is not sophisticated enough actually to start putting money in a loss-making venture today. So, therefore, in order to meet the funding requirement, we will have to go out. And for that, we need an ecosystem wherein a foreign investor feels comfortable that his money coming into the India will not get stuck. And that's what we have to ensure.
Absolutely. Yes, and speaking of funding, the government is saying in its recommendations that we need to create a facilitative environment for e-commerce enterprises to raise funds domestically, encourage Indian companies to invest in startups, raising caps on pension funds to invest in VCs, etc. I mean, this is prescriptive stuff, good in intent, but nobody is stopping Indian companies from investing in e-commerce companies today. The question is, how do you ensure that in fact happens? And by putting in these restrictions, will you block foreign capital from coming into India? But Abhiraj, if the government is listening, what is your message?
I think now that the intention to come out with an e-commerce policy is apparently clear, I would strongly encourage. I would say two strong points. One would be to start with minimal regulation, to err on the side of not regulating to the extent possible. I think probably much more importantly, I think it's important that the person who's heading this effort is somebody who's a domain expert, who comes with an understanding of what e-commerce is all about. Think of Sam Petroda for telecom. I think at this point of time, again, intentions are all good, but some of the folks from the government who are actually formulating this policy may not be best positioned to actually create it.
All right, Abhiraj, Amarjeet and Mr. Dua, appreciate you joining us here as we discuss the implications of the draft e-commerce policy that has been put in place by the government. Well, joining us now is Mukesh Aghi. Mukesh, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Let me start by asking you about what you've made of the draft e-commerce policy. I mean, it covers the whole gamut of issues from regulation to funding to pricing and discounting to even things like data storage. What is the reaction of companies based in the US on the back of what you've seen in the draft e-commerce policy?
Well, I think the reaction has not been that positive, because when you look at it, you have government trying to almost run a business itself, and I think government's job is not to run business or manage business itself. I think the draft policy discriminates multinationals against the local companies. It focuses on how much discount you can give. Yeah. You can't do bulk sales. I think we need to have a little consultative process to improve on the draft policy.
Okay, specifically, Mukesh, what are the big areas of concern? You talked about or alluded to the clauses related to pricing and discounting. Is that the big pain point that US retailers and e-commerce companies are most concerned about? Is that what is causing them the most sort of pain at this point in time?
No, I think there are bigger issues. For example, it has its own localization charter as compared to when you look at the localization charter coming from RBI and other localization. I think it's important that we have one consistent policy across the board, across the country itself on localization. I think they talk about having a regulator. Yes. I think you already have a process on customer duress, on other issues. So why do you put a regulator on e-commerce itself? So I think there are multiple areas which are cause of concern. But more important is if you go with this draft document, it will discourage investment coming into the country, because you cannot have companies like Amazon or Walmart spend billions of dollars and you change the goalpost once again itself. Okay. So I think we have to be consistent, we have to be transparent, and we have to provide equal access both to local and multinationals. So you're saying that if this were to go through, it would mean that India is changing the goalpost, and that is not going to go down well with people like Walmart and Amazon who have committed significant investments to India. You brought up the localization issue, and you're absolutely right. The e-commerce policy has its own version of data storage and localization. You've got the Sri Krishna Committee report, which has also put forward its recommendations on localization, and then you're dealing with the RBI circular, which currently still stands. On localization, what is the big challenge? If I were to look at what the Sri Krishna Committee is suggesting now, it's saying that for any processing activity of personal data inside or outside India, one mirror copy shall be required to be retained in India. What are you most concerned about? So I think you have to understand what is the issue here. The issue here is access to data, which should be easily available. There are multiple ways to provide that access. We're not saying that government of India has a sovereign right to have that access to data. We're not saying you should not have. I think you can look at something called Cloud Act in the US, where Indian government can sign an agreement with the US government, and you have access to the data on a local original source basis. If that is not appetizing, you can probably look at having some kind of a mirroring concept. Now, it does have an impact. If you look at Google Map, if you try to divide the data, then you don't get live coverage, instant coverage from that perspective. Or if you are in the fraud area, if you isolate that, then you're completely out of cyber fraud from a global basis itself. And I think if you lose a credit card today, in India, within 2 hours of being charged either in London, Hong Kong, or other geographies, you want to be part of the global cyber security also. So I think we have to look at this carefully. We're not saying that the government should not have access to the data. I think there should be a consultative process with the industry to address the issue itself.
Okay. How concerned would you be now, Mukesh, that perhaps there could be challenges for the Flipkart-Walmart deal? It is a matter that's currently being looked at by the competition regulator. There has already been action in the court where the Swadeshi Jagran Manch and other affiliates and trade bodies claim that it's a violation of the FDI rules. Is there now a degree of nervousness and anxiety building up in the minds of foreign investors, specifically when it comes to these large retail transactions?
Well, I think, when you have a company which is spending over $16 billion trying to enter the market and probably may have a few more $1 billion behind it to cover operational costs itself, they will be nervous. And I think you have to understand, it's not just one company. Then it sends a message to the rest of the companies also that, hey, is India the right destination for our investment itself? So I think where I'm coming from is India is still very attractive to US companies. They see India as a market which has provided a level playing field in every aspect. And if you keep on changing the role, then it does have an impact on FDI coming in.
Okay. Well, Mukesh, we're still awaiting a final policy from the government, if at all. Many of these recommendations that find themselves in the draft will be taken forward or not is the big question. But you're saying that US companies are concerned and worried about the fact that India seems to be changing the goalpost in the middle once again. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Many thanks for your time. Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
Mukesh.
thank you, but I just want to add one thing. I think it's a democracy. It's a democracy, and I think I have to applaud the government which is going through a consultative process. And in the end, I think common sense will prevail, which will be a win-win for multinational, for local, for government access to data. So I'm quite confident that things will go in the right way in the near short term itself.
All right, Mukesh, thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV18.